You let her think I died in that fire, I said. And my mother-in-law's coffee cup slipped right out of her hand and shattered across her kitchen floor. She didn't even look down at the mess. She just stared at me like I was a ghost who had walked in through the wall, and in a way, I guess I was, because the woman she'd spent 9 years believing was dead was standing in her doorway, holding her own grandson's hand, and the only person in that room who looked more shaken than her was the man I'd helped carry his groceries up 3 flights of stairs 40 minutes earlier. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the Tuesday it all started, because nothing good has ever happened to me on a Tuesday, and this one was no exception. It was the second week of October, one of those gray Cleveland mornings where the wind comes off Lake Erie like it's got a personal grudge against you. I was walking the 4 blocks from my apartment to the diner where I waitressed the breakfast shift, and I was already running late because the alarm on my cracked phone had decided not to go off. My name's Hollis. Well, that's what everyone calls me. My full name's a whole production nobody uses. So I'm hustling down Detroit Avenue, head down, coat pulled tight, and that's when I see him. An older man, maybe 70, standing at the bottom of an apartment stoop, with 4 grocery bags cutting red lines into his hands, looking up at those steps like they were Mount Everest. He had one of those faces, kind, tired. The kind of face that's done a lot of worrying. And he was wearing a cardigan with a hole in the elbow that somebody had tried to mend with the wrong color thread. I should have kept walking. I was late. My manager Roy docked you 15 minutes pay if you were even a minute past clocking, and I needed every dollar. But my mama raised me a certain way before everything fell apart, and you don't unlearn that. Let me grab a couple of those for you, I said. He startled a little, then gave me this grateful smile that just about broke my heart. Oh, you don't have to do that, young lady. I can manage. I always manage. I know you can, I said, already taking 2 of the bags, but your hands are going to fall off, and then who's going to carry them tomorrow? He laughed at that, a real laugh, and we started up the stairs together. 3rd floor, no elevator. By the 2nd landing, he had to stop and catch his breath. 1 hand on the railing, and I pretended to need a break too, so he wouldn't feel embarrassed. We talked while he caught his wind. His name was Walt. He told me his wife had passed 2 springs ago and he was still learning how to grocery shop for 1 person instead of 2, that he kept buying too much and half of it went bad in the fridge. My granddaughter used to do my shopping, he said, and something flickered across his face when he said it. A long time ago, different life. She not around anymore? He was quiet for a second. No, he said, no, she's not. I didn't push. We all carry things. I set his bags down inside his little apartment. Clean, but lonely clean, the kind of clean that comes from one person with too much time and nobody to make a mess. He insisted on pressing a $5 bill into my hand, and I insisted right back that he keep it, and finally we compromised. He'd keep his 5 and I'd take a banana from the bunch I just carried up. He laughed again at that. You're a good girl, he said at the door. What's your name? Hollis. Something passed over his face, quick like a cloud, but it was gone before I could read it. Well, Hollis, he said, you made an old man's whole week. You take care now. I made it to the diner 11 minutes late. Roy docked me. I didn't care. Some mornings you just feel like you did one thing right. Now here's the part you need to understand about me. I didn't grow up poor. That's what made the poor part hurt so bad. I knew the difference. My parents had a nice house out in Rocky River. My dad ran a small contracting company, and we weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Then when I was 23, my dad's truck got hit by a guy who ran a red light on Clifton Boulevard, and just like that, both my parents were gone. Same accident. 1 stupid second. I was an only child, so it was just me. And there was my grandfather on my dad's side. But I'd been told my whole life that he was a cold, bitter old man who'd cut my father off years ago, who never wanted anything to do with us, who didn't even come to my parents' funeral. I was told this by the one person I had left in the world after the crash, my aunt, my dad's older sister. Her name was Corinne, and after the funeral she took me in. I was grieving, I was 23 and lost, and she opened her arms and her home, and I was so grateful I could have cried. She handled everything. The estate, the paperwork, the insurance, all the things I was too gutted to look at. "Don't you worry about any of that, sweetheart," she'd say. Family takes care of family. Here's what I didn't know then. My parents had life insurance, a house with equity. My dad's business had value, and there was supposed to be a trust, money my grandfather had set up for me when I was born that my parents had added to over the years. College fund, future fund, all of it. I never saw a dime of any of it. Corinne told me the insurance barely covered the debts. She told me the house had a second mortgage I never knew about and had to be sold to break even. She told me there was no trust, that I must have misremembered, that my parents weren't the savers I imagined, and I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was crying right alongside me. She was the only family I had. She got me a job at her own real estate office, doing reception and filing, paying me just enough to rent a studio and not quite enough to ever get ahead. For 9 years, I answered her phones and scheduled her showings and called her Aunt Corinne with love, and I never once questioned why a woman who claimed to be barely scraping by had just put an addition on her house in Westlake and bought a Lexus. I told myself I was lucky to have her. I told myself family was everything. That's the thing about being grateful to someone. It makes you blind in exactly the spot they need you blind. So, back to Walt and his groceries. I figured that was a one-time thing, a nice little moment in an otherwise gray week. But 2 days later, I'm walking the same route and there he is at the bus stop, and his face just lights up when he sees me. Hollis, my lucky charm. We ended up at the same little coffee counter, and he bought me a cup even though I tried to pay, and we talked for almost an hour. He was easy to talk to in the way that lonely people sometimes are, like they've saved up a whole reservoir of conversation. He asked about my life, and I found myself telling him more than I'd told anyone in years, about my parents, the accident, my aunt taking me in, my job at the real estate office. When I mentioned the office, he went very still. "Your aunt," he said carefully. "What's her name?" "Corinne." "Corinne Datchett. She runs Datchett Realty over on Lake Avenue." I watched something happen to his face that I'll never forget. It went pale, then almost gray, and his hand shook so badly he set his coffee down. "What's wrong?" I said. "Walt, are you okay? Do you need—" "Your father," he said, and his voice cracked clean in half. "Your father's name, was it Thomas?" The whole world went quiet. The espresso machine, the traffic outside, all of it just dropped away. "How do you know my dad's name?" He reached across the table and took both my hands in his, and his eyes were full of tears, and he said the thing that broke my entire life open like an egg. "Because Thomas was my son, and they told me you were dead." I want to tell you I said something wise or composed. I didn't. I sat there in a coffee shop on Detroit Avenue and cried in front of a stranger who wasn't a stranger at all, who was my grandfather, the cold, bitter old man who hadn't come to the funeral. Except he had come. He'd been told there was no funeral to come to. He'd been told his son's child had died in the same crash. He'd spent 9 years thinking he had no one left, mending his own cardigans with the wrong color thread, while I lived 20 minutes away thinking the exact same thing in reverse. We pieced it together right there over cold coffee. His name was Walter Brennan. Yes, like the old actor, he said. He'd heard every joke. He hadn't cut my father off. It was the other way around, or that's what he'd been led to believe. Years before the accident, there'd been a falling out, a stupid argument blown up bigger than it should have been, and somewhere in the middle of it was Corinne, carrying messages back and forth between her father and her brother. Messages I was beginning to understand, that had been edited. After the crash, Walt had gotten a phone call from Corinne. She told him Thomas was gone, and his granddaughter, both killed instantly. She told him the funeral had already happened, a small private thing, that Thomas's last wishes were that his estranged father not attend. She told him there was nothing left, no estate to speak of, that Thomas had died in debt. And then she handled everything, including, it turned out, the trust my grandfather had set up for me, the trust he'd been quietly adding to for 23 years, the trust that, with my parents' contributions and the insurance and the house equity, came to just shy of $400,000. all of it had gone to one place, to Datchet Realty, to the addition in Westlake and the Lexus and the 9 years of barely scraping by. I should have felt rage. The rage came later. What I felt first, sitting in that coffee shop, was the strangest grief. Grief for 9 years I could have had with this gentleman, 9 years he spent alone because someone decided his loneliness was worth less than a renovated kitchen. Here's where I'm supposed to tell you I marched into the office and confronted her. I didn't. And I want to be honest about why, because I think a lot of people would have, and maybe it would have felt good for about 4 seconds. But 4 seconds of feeling good wasn't going to get my grandfather his money back or hold anyone accountable. Corinne was smart, and she was careful, and she'd had 9 years and a real estate license, and probably a very good accountant to bury what she'd done. If I stormed in there screaming, all I'd do is warn her. She'd lawyer up, the documents would have a tragic accident in a shredder, and it'd be my word, a flighty waitress/receptionist, against a respected businesswoman who'd generously taken in her poor orphan niece. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I went to work the next morning and the morning after that, and I smiled at her and I answered her phones and I called her Aunt Corinne and I gave absolutely nothing away. Because Walt knew a lawyer. His late wife's nephew, a man named Desmond O'Coffer, did estate litigation downtown, and he agreed to meet us as a favor to Walt that became a lot more than a favor once he heard the details. He told us what we needed, documentation. Not accusations, not feelings. Paper, the original trust agreement, which Walt actually still had a copy of in a fireproof box. God bless careful old men. The death records that would show I was very much alive. And then, the hard part, proof of where the money had actually gone. And I, as it happened, worked at the exact place where those records lived. For 3 weeks, I was a spy in my own life. I came in early. I stayed late, catching up on filing. I learned which cabinets Corinne kept locked, and where she kept the little key taped under the lip of her desk drawer, like she was in a movie. I photographed trust transfer documents and account statements and a letter, in her own handwriting, to the trust administrator, claiming to be my legal guardian and the sole surviving beneficiary, dated 4 months after I'd turned 18 and stopped being anyone's anything. Every night I'd drive to Walt's apartment and we'd add the day's photos to a folder Desmond was building, and Walt would make us tea, and we'd talk. I learned that my grandmother had played the piano, that my dad as a boy once tried to dig to China in the backyard and hit a water main, that my grandfather had been saving a particular bottle of bourbon for my father's 40th birthday, a birthday Thomas never reached, and that Walt still had the bottle and couldn't bring himself to open it or throw it out. Those 3 weeks, as terrifying as they were, gave me back a family, and every morning I'd go in and smile at the woman who'd stolen one from me, and I'd think, not yet. Not yet. The hardest moment came near the end. Corinne caught me at the locked cabinet one evening. I'd lost track of time, and she came back for her phone. My heart stopped, but I'd thought ahead, and I had a manila folder of actual filing in my other hand, and I just looked up, bored, and said, "These Hendricks closing docs go in the H drawer, the active file." And she rolled her eyes and said the active file, like I was an idiot, and left. I sat down in the dark afterward and shook for 10 minutes. But we got it. We got all of it. Desmond filed quietly. The state takes a very dim view of trustees and guardians who divert minors' and beneficiaries' funds, especially with a paper trail like the one Corinne had so confidently left. There was an investigation. Then there were charges: felony theft, forgery, criminal fraud, the kind of words that don't go away. The day they came to the office was a Tuesday, of course it was. I wasn't there when they walked her out, and I'm not sad I missed it. What I picture instead is the moment from the start of this story. Because that came first, before the police, before any of it was official. The day I finally brought Walt to that office, and Corinne came out of her glass corner office to greet a client and saw, instead, her dead niece holding her father's hand. That's when her coffee cup hit the floor, not in her kitchen. I lied a little, telescoped it for you, the way memory does. It was in the office, on the grey industrial carpet, and the splash hit the bottom of her $400 slacks, and she didn't move. "Hello, Corinne," Walt said, in a voice I'd never heard him use. "You're looking well, Better than you said I was anyway. She tried. God, she tried. Dad. Hollis, what is this? What's he telling you? He's not well. He hasn't been well in years. Stop, I said. Just that. And she did. I didn't scream. I'd done my screaming alone in my car over those 3 weeks. I just looked at her and said, "You let me believe I had no one. You let him believe the same thing, and you bought a Lexus." And then Walt and I turned around and walked out, and we left her standing in the wreckage of her coffee cup. And that was the last conversation I ever had with my aunt outside of a courtroom. The trial wasn't quick. These things never are. She took a plea in the end. They always do when the paper is that clean, and got 4 years and a restitution order she'll be paying off until she's older than Walt is now. I got most of the money back eventually. Not all of it. Some of it was just gone, evaporated into 9 years of a life I'll never get to live differently. But enough. You want to know what I did with it? I didn't buy a Lexus. I'll tell you that. I went back to school. I'd always wanted to do something in social work. To be, I think, for some other lost 23-year-old, what nobody honest had been for me. I'm in my 2nd year now. I kept waitressing part-time, partly for the money and partly because Roy, gruff as he is, gave me a shift when I had nothing. And you don't forget that. And I sold my studio apartment lease and moved into a 2-bedroom in Lakewood. The 2nd bedroom is Walt's. He fought me on it. I don't need taking care of, I always manage, and I told him I knew he could manage, but who was going to carry his groceries tomorrow? He didn't have an answer for that. We opened a bourbon, not for my dad's 40th. That day's gone. We opened it on what would have been my parents' anniversary, and we drank 1 small glass each. And Walt told me the story of how my dad once tried to dig to China, and I laughed so hard I cried. Or maybe it was the other way around. People ask me sometimes if I forgive her, my aunt. They ask it like there's a right answer, like forgiveness is a door you either walk through or you don't. Here's the truth. I don't spend my energy on her. She doesn't get my anger anymore. She had 9 years of my gratitude, and that was 9 years too many. What I think about instead is that grey Tuesday, the cold wind off the lake, an old man with a hole in his cardigan looking up a flight of stairs he didn't think he could climb. I almost walked past him. I was late. I needed the money. I had every reason in the world to keep my head down and keep moving. I think about how the whole rest of my life turned on the smallest thing a person can do, the decision to stop and pick up someone else's heavy bags and climb the stairs together. Last week, Walt taught me to make his wife's pierogi recipe. Got flour everywhere. The kitchen was a disaster, the good kind, the kind that comes from 2 people making a mess together. It's not lonely clean anymore. Neither of us is. What stays with me isn't the courtroom or the restitution order or even the look on my aunt's face when her coffee cup shattered on that grey carpet. It's the 4 blocks of sidewalk on Detroit Avenue and a man with a hole in his cardigan looking up a staircase he didn't think he could climb. I was late. I was broke. I had every reason to keep my head down. And the truth I keep circling back to is that the entire shape of my life bent on one small choice that cost me 11 minutes and a docked paycheck. I used to think being a good person was about the big moments, the ones where you stand up and make a speech. It's not. Walter was put in my path on an ordinary Tuesday, and all that was asked of me was to stop. The reason any of this turned out the way it did is that I'd held on to the one thing Corinne could never take, no matter how much money she funneled into that Lexus. The instinct to help someone weaker than me when no one was watching. That instinct didn't make me rich. For 9 years, it made me poor and tired, but it's also the exact thing that walked me up those stairs and into the only family I had left. Here's what I learned the hard way, and what I'd want my own kid to understand someday. Kindness without sense is just a target painted on your back. I was kind, and Corinne used my gratitude like a blindfold, and I let her for 9 years, because I never once stopped to ask the obvious questions. The day everything changed wasn't the day I got angry. Anger is cheap. Anyone can manage it. It was the day I got quiet and started thinking. I didn't storm the office. I learned where the key was taped. I photographed the paper. I sat across from a lawyer and built a case instead of a tantrum. Feeling wronged is the easy part. Proving it calmly while smiling at the person who wronged you every single morning, that's the part that actually frees you. And none of it would have mattered if I'd quit. There were nights in that car parked outside Walter's building where my hand shook so badly I couldn't get the key in the ignition. 3 weeks of pretending. 3 weeks of pretending. 3 weeks of being two people. Every cell in my body wanted to scream the truth at her and be done. I didn't, because I'd finally figured out that the satisfying thing and the right thing are almost never the same speed. If you take anything from Walter and me, take this. Be the person who stops on the staircase. That part is your character, and it's the only thing that's truly yours. But pair it with the patience to think before you swing, and the spine to hold the line when holding it costs you. A soft heart and a sharp mind and a stubborn will. Alone, each one will get you hurt. Together, they got an old man his life back and gave me one I actually want to live.